This is the continuing reading of the book Transactionalism by Trevor Phillips. Editor's note. Trevor Phillips wrote the following dissertation in 1967. The editors have chosen to honor the integrity of the original manuscript, with the exception of a few spelling and punctuation edits intended to support understanding and clarity. The manuscript published here remains intact. It contains references, style, word, grammatical, and spelling choices commonly used at that time. Additionally, we have added only a few clarifying footnotes to some words, phrases, or references to support the intent of the subject matter. In the rare instance where non-original text was required, we inserted brackets to denote this change. We are grateful for the good work of those who helped make this book possible and thank the members and staff of Influence Ecology for their encouragement and support. Finally, we thank you for your contribution and invite you to join us in our inquiry and study. John Patterson and Kirkland Tybbalds, Ojai, California, July 2014. Acknowledgements. It has been a source of constant gratification to know that throughout the preparation and writing of this study, there have been individuals who have extended their moral support over and above their roles as academic advisors. I wish to recognize the support of my associate advisors, Dr. Glenn C. Atkins and Dr. William T. Grun, whose friendship dates from my earliest association with the University of Connecticut, and Dr. Sermon M. Stonage, who doubles also as a colleague on the faculty of Bowling Green State University. In this connection, I am indebted to the Dean of Graduate School at the University of Connecticut, who made it possible for Dr. Stanage to serve on my committee. Words alone fail to express the debt of gratitude I owe to my committee chairman, Dr. I.N. Thut. In recent months, I have been immodestly free with my solicitations for advice and assistance, but always has he responded willingly and eagerly to my needs. No student could have wished for such quality of guidance as it has been my fortune to have acquired from Dr. Thut. I am tempted to add that no student has been less deserving of such support and guidance. Suffice it to say that the weaknesses of this study are of my own doing and would surely have proven to be sheer inadequacies without the constant counsel of Dr. Thut. To my family I owe a special word of praise. My wife has accepted my long hours away from home stoically, having assumed the twin roles of mother and father with an ease and skill which, in retrospect, is frankly disarming. It is my sincere hope that with the completion of this dissertation my frame of mind will have become sufficiently reconstructed so that finally my children and their mother will be recompensed for the many rough hours they have spent in the company of a short-tempered, oftentimes irrational father and husband during the past 18 months. Trevor J. Phillips, Bowling Green, Ohio, May 1996. Chapter 1. Introduction. During the past few decades, increased interest has been generated and greater use made of the transactional approach to philosophical problems in general and education in particular. Inquiry in various disciplines has been launched from this approach, and although proof of such involvement appears in scattered articles and some larger works, no systematic and comprehensive account of this basically new approach to philosophical inquiry or of its origin and development has been attempted. Statement of the problem. It is the purpose of this study to trace the growth of the transactional movement from its philosophical and psychological origins to its present theoretical and practical applications, to investigate the writings of its leading proponents, and to attempt an evaluation of its significance, particularly for education. The schools of transactional philosophy and psychology represent a relatively new approach to the ancient and perennial problems of perceiving and knowing. The idealistic and realistic philosophers have traditionally provided answers to these problems and have thereby long dominated the epistemological and the ontological scene. Transactionalism questions the assumptions underlying these widely held beliefs and posits some basic presuppositions of its own. In this study, an attempt will be made to identify these and subsequently to interpret them in terms of their meaning for the classroom. Importance of the study. In a society whose professed structure is founded upon personal integrity and individual choice, but in which one may observe the ever-increasing growth of bureaucratic rule and the attendant rise of a complacent citizenry, there is obvious need for a reassessment of that society's philosophical, psychological complex, its Weltanschauung. Perhaps the contemporary interest being shown by young people in existentialism has been generated in part by a feeling of alienation from the world and its problems. Certainly, the magnitude of existentialism's following testifies to its success as it calls upon its devotees to believe that through a matrix of anxiety and despair, feelings of alienation may be understood, and a semblance of personal worth, freedom, and responsibility achieved. Transactionalism, too, emphasizes the intrinsic importance and dignity of each person. Far from submitting to the alienation syndrome, however, it lays stress upon the interdependence of all aspects of experience and upon the integration of man and his surroundings. Leading transactional psychologists go so far as to define the act of living itself as a process in which one participates in the creation of an environment, and thereby the structuring of existence itself. It is this very participation in creation which, say the transactionalists, gives to each person his unique status and dignity. Because the transactional approach to life emphasizes human dignity and uniqueness, and this view seems to run contrary to the advancing conformity and coercive competition so characteristic of our times, it seems most proper to trace the origin and development of the transactional approach, to examine its orientation, and to indicate the implications it may have for education, the area in which the relationship between the individual and his environment is of paramount concern. Organization and procedure. The writer's investigations, of which the present study represents the culmination, radiated from the central point, the joint writings of John Dewey and Arthur F. Bentley, whose formulation of transactionalism is widely regarded as the fountainhead of subsequent inquiries and interpretations. Accordingly, this study is organized into 3 chapters of descriptive material: an historical survey, an examination of contemporary philosophical transactionalism, and a detailed account of one application of the Dewey-Bentley system, transactional psychology. The final chapter will investigate the manner in which transactional tenets have been and could be applied to the educative process. A survey of the literature indicated that several historical movements and personages have been credited with providing the inspiration for modern transactional theory. A report of these will constitute the nucleus for Chapter 2, and a preliminary definition will be proffered at the conclusion of the chapter. Chapter 3, Transactionalism in Contemporary Philosophy, will examine in detail the system known as transactional philosophy, through the enumeration of its basic tenets and an investigation of several of its theories. Chapter 4 will be concerned with the writings of the leading transactional psychologists, mostly of the post-Dewey era. Their writings explore one area of application, an important one for education, of the transactional philosophical assumptions. Finally, Chapter 5 will attempt to consider the application of transactionalism to the educative process, It is an assumption of the writer that all social institutions would benefit greatly from a close scrutiny of the transactional point of view, particularly the school. Consequently, some projections of the approach into the learning process and the classroom situation itself will be made. The chapter is terminated by an evaluation of the study's findings and concluding statements. Review of the literature. Any survey of the literature of transactionalism must distinguish between works devoted to the development and interpretation of the approach and those whose aim it is to examine a particular discipline from the transactional point of view. The nature of the present study demands that the literature reviewed fall into the former category. Other writings will be cited later in the study and in the bibliography. The joint publication in 1949 by Dewey and Bentley of Knowing in the Known brought together the parallel thoughts and ideas of these two men. They investigated the nature of the transactional approach, with particular reference to physical science and human society. The importance of their joint effort is indicated by the fact that creative research in so many diverse disciplines in the early 1950s had stemmed directly from concepts set forth in Knowing in the Known. The following year, Bentley wrote a short article in which he attempted to restate the central assumptions of his philosophical position, and at the same time interpret the main tenets of Knowing in the Known. This essay subsequently appeared in an anthology of Bentley's shorter works, an anthology which, with Spirit and Perception, traced the growth and development of the transactional approach as Bentley, that insightful scholar who had been trained as a sociologist and political scientist, had set it forth. The literature is replete with articles by the transactional psychologists represented by Adelbert Ames Jr. and Hadley Cantrill. The main ideas of the former have been compiled and edited by Cantrill, who has enlarged upon them in numerous articles and longer works. Two of these are particularly instructive and serve admirably to introduce the interested reader to the topic. They are The Why of Man's Experience and Reflections on the Human Venture. A more technical volume, edited by Kilpatrick, describes and analyzes the demonstrations in visual perception devised by Ames. Another serious effort to probe into the meaning and interpretation of transactionalism was made by the journal ETC, etc., the official organ of the International Society for General Semantics. An entire issue was devoted to transactional psychology. However, applied transactionalism was merely one aspect of the report. The issue included articles by the physicist P.W. Bridgman, who drew similarities between his operationalism and the transactional approach, and philosopher Donald Ayres Piatt. The latter attempted to explain the significance of transaction, as that term is found in the writings of John Dewey. It is not surprising that semanticists have shown keen interest in transactionalism. Vicious language habits are viewed by them, as well as by the transactionalists, as inimical to the solution of the problems which confront mankind. The transactional approach is, as the present study will indicate, in part an insistence upon the employment of firm language. The most recent investigation of transactionalism was undertaken by Henry Miller, who briefly examined the basic position as it emerged from the writings of Dewey and interpreted it for the learning process. His review of the contributions from the behavioral sciences is especially valuable, and his interpretation of the impact of the theory on education is also helpful. Reference is now made to a work which chronologically was published subsequent to the foregoing material. It is a compilation of correspondence between Dewey and Bentley extending from the early 30s to the 50s. The collection, which was recently published in book form, is without doubt the greatest single contribution to the literature on the transactional point of view. Through a careful and deliberate treading of the work, One is able to follow the correspondence as, painfully and meticulously, yet with constant good humor, they constructed the foundations of their joint undertaking, which was later released as Knowing and the Known. A feature of the correspondence which renders it indispensable to this study of transactionalism is the inclusion by the editors of several first drafts of chapters, as well as 2 articles by Dewey hitherto unpublished. The genesis and systematic elaboration of a common point of view was easily located and followed through these latter writings. Finally, attention is drawn to a book which, although it does not specifically refer to transactionalism by name, is nevertheless a thorough and lucid study of the development of the transactional point of view as propounded by Dewey. The work is Bode's How We Learn, an imaginative and concise introduction to both transactional philosophy and psychology in their earlier guise of pragmatic functionalism. The failure of Bode's book and of others in the field to make specific reference to and to focus upon the concept of transactionalism points to an interesting observation. As late as the early 1960s, texts concerned with the philosophy of Dewey, and particularly those relating to his educational philosophy, were devoid of reference to the concept. Thoot's Story of Education would appear to have been one of the first textbooks devoting even minimum space to it. Only in the past decade, almost 20 years after the publication of Knowing and the Known, has there been a growing realization by the authors of educational works that transactional formulations are worthy of inclusion and discussion. The present chapter may be concluded with an assertion of the obvious. A review of the literature revealed a paucity of material pertaining to the history and interpretation of transactionalism. This study would appear, therefore, to be timely, and hopefully may in some measure provide new understandings. That concludes Chapter 1.